now we have, hello, welcome back again. And now we have the last panel of today. I will be moderating it. I'm Murat Yüksel. And in this panel, we have 4 speakers, but 3 presentations. First, we have Nezahat Gündoğan and Kazım Gündoğan. Let me say a few things about them. Nezahat Gündoğan finished the Trakya University Engineering Department in the 1980s, and then she had to leave her studies for some time, and 6.5 years later, she was free, and then she followed the courses organized by the Turkish Association of Human Rights. And Nezahat is the first to do a documentary on Dersim with the title, "What if the Munzur River stops flowing?" And this was followed by the Lost Girls of Dersim, which she shot with Kazım 3 years later. And later on, they worked on a book together on these films, and Dersim's Lost Girls was also published as a book. And they are still making documentaries, and she's also an architect. Her last work is titled Hayvai Zaman, and it is about a Dersim woman who was uprooted from her family 34 years ago, and of her story now. And it was awarded the Special Jury Award in the Golden Orange Festival in Adana. Let me say a few words about Kazım Gündoğan as well. And in 1963, he was born in Dersim Ovacık. After the 1980 coup d'etat, he left Dersim to settle down in Istanbul. And he himself, just like Nezahat, had to spend his years in prison. And after being freed from prison, he wrote different articles in various newspapers and periodicals, and they worked on the same documentaries together, Dersim's Lost Girls, and collaborated for the books. And at present, he is still doing his research work on Dersim Armenians. You have the floor.
Thank you. I wish everyone a good evening. I would like to thank everyone who has helped organize this conference. Within the very comprehensive research that we carried out on Dersim and the Lost Girls of Dersim, we had already started working on Dersim Armenians as well. These are not only victims of 1915, but also of 1937-38. We will be focusing on their stories. We will be making this presentation together. I will be talking about the history, but we really dwell on the stories of Dersim Armenians. And within this, in the Hawar village, there's the Surp Garabet church. we will be dwelling mostly on the story of the family who lives in this village. The Dersim Armenians have a very long-rooted, long past history in this region, up to 3,500 years. Historically, they have always had a homogeneous kind of character up until the last century. Armenians, Kermanchzazas, and Turkmens and Turks, even Turks, lived together in this area, so it was heterogeneous in that sense. With respect to faiths, Kızılbaş Alevilik, Alevi and Christianity and Islam coexisted here. Within the first few years of the Ottoman domination in this region at the beginning of the 16th century, this was the Çemişgezek Sancak of that period. This is Tunceli. In the books that were kept, the Armenian families are documented to be around 57% of the population. Well, the speaker said Armenian, but she meant Christian. So among these there are Greeks and Syriacs, but the majority is Armenian. Then under the Celali revolts, in both the revolt and in quelling the revolt, the Alevis who lived in Dersim and in the near environments, as a result of plundering and everything, had to leave their homes. Kemah, Ain, Erzincan, Divri were areas which lost population to Istanbul and Thrace. And the Ciminli Üzümlü village of Erzincan converted en masse from Armenian Christianity into Alevis. Although we don't know exactly the details of this, there is this kind of information. But this kind of transformation tending towards the Alevis, this is not remembered very much, but the 1896, the 1915 and 1938 involve situations where many Armenians converted into Alevism. They know their past identity, the future generations. Until 1915, the Armenians, under repression and emigration, they had to leave their homes, but nonetheless it was an important home for them. The Istanbul Patriarchate made a census in 1914, and there were 16,000 people here. Kızıl Kilise, Pilov, Çemişgezek, Blümür are the centers. There are about 100 villages here. The general perception is here, especially for the period after 1915, those Armenians that fled from the 1915 genocide took refuge in Dersim, people think, but I can easily say that one of the established people in Dersim were Armenians. There, of course, yes, at that time some people took refuge in Dersim, but there were people who took refuge here in order to protect themselves near the tribes. Then they passed over to Erzurum and then into the Caucasus. But until 1915, they had an integrity with respect to the linguistic, religious, and ethnic tissue. We became the agricultural hands of the land that we used to own before, was what somebody said. Well, under the Republic, well, the Lausanne, of course, was when the frontiers were established. There was a 1924 constitution that established the legal framework, and the 1925 Eastern Reform Plan, the political and social objectives in this region. İsmet İnönü, the Prime Minister of the time and second President of the Republic, said in 1925, "We will make everyone who lives on this fatherland, the territory of this fatherland, a Turk and a Turkist. Those who do not accept being a Turk or Turkist will be systematically decimated." Well, a new class had been created in 1915 anyway, the Turks, the Turkish bourgeoisie. But after 1925, the Kurds were the target of this liquidation plan. Up until this period, 1936-38, the Dersim people were put in a special place because it's not homogeneous, first of all. And the Kızılbaş tradition, along with the ethnic structure, is very original. So they did not take this up in the context of the general Kurdish question, but left it behind up until 1936-38. The approach of the state to the Dersim Armenians is to categorize them into two. One, Armenians converted into Alevism, and Christian Armenians. Well, in Nazimiye Hakis, Derovan, Mazgit, Khosinke, Danaburan, Zorbian, Shorda, Chuhur, and Hozat are districts where certain villages are Armenians that were subjected to that accepted Kızılbaş ideology or faith. But then there were Armenians that kept to their Christianity. The districts where they lived are Halvori, Torut, Zmek, Ergan, Akraksin, Mameki, Merho. These are regions that the state was not able to reach in 1915. They carried on their existence until 1938. There is a testimony here. Different witnesses tell us there is almost similar things. In 1937, 1938, 38 in particular, the Armenians who live in these regions, in villages, were separated from the Kızılbaş and massacred separately. And the explanation here is that Christian blood should not be mixed with Muslim blood. Of course, when the occasion permits, the Kızılbaş are said not to be Muslims either, but the Christian Armenians are even more alien to Turks. As we see in these examples, there is a general Dersim problem and an Dersim Armenian problem in particular. This is something that we document in our presentation. When we come to 1938, the only institutional space where Christianity continues with respect to the Armenian community is the village Halvori and the Saint Garabet, Sup Garabet monastery. So they lived around this monastery. So we'll dwell on one family living here. This is the family of a monk, This is, still, this has survived, this institution has survived up until 1938. It was bombed then. And the family is dispersed all around, the survivors, and they have to submit to different cultures. I do hope that I have used the time wisely. I will now leave the floor to Kazım in order to tell us about the family of the monk. Thank you. Thank you, Nezahat. I would also like to thank everyone who has contributed to this event, and I greet you all with respect. The monastery and the family of the monk, they are almost a whole that, have integrated into one each other. In Armenian, the word for monastery is vank. So the hamlet where the monastery is called vank. So we will be talking about Halvari and vank. The presentation will be on these. Levon Lulegian from Kharpet, who took refuge in Dersim in 1915-16, gives us a bit of information about Vank. He says, although the number is not very high, a group of Christian Armenians live in this area, and the land here is tied to the monastery, and they lead a collective life, and the area where they live is in a region which is within the tribe of Sayyid Reza. The Supgarabed monastery has a very long history. According to certain sources, it used to exist as a temple even before the Christian era. Then after the Armenians accepted Christianity or adopted Christianity, this was converted, it is said, into a monastery. We have been doing this work on Dersim Armenians since 2010, but lately we have focused on the family of the monk and the Vank. Why? Because, as Nezahat has said, until the 1937-38 period, this was an institution. It was a center, and the other Christian Armenians in Dersim, in order to accomplish their religious rituals, used to go to this spot several times a year. Sometimes they brought the priests here to their villages. Before coming to this period, we did emphasize that the state had a problem with respect to the Christian Armenians of Dersim. In 1926, for instance, Sarkis Minasyan, an Armenian personality in the Çemişgezek region, the state wants this person from the Agas of Dersim. Do not let this person, this leader, take refuge in Dersim. But the people of Dersim did not turn him in. In 1937-38, one of the places, one of the places that was bombed first is the monastery. The monastery is decimated. All the cultural artifacts are taken away. In the newspapers of the period, this is all exposed, and this is used against Sayyid Reza when he was being judged. Of course, it is very difficult to present this under the pressure of time. After we pursued the traces of this family of the monk, it was very difficult. Then in Sparta we found a lost girl of Dersim, and this was, we determined, an Armenian girl. And after the interview we had with her, she is one of the, we found out that she was one of the grandchildren of the monk. She's given to her family from Ahsan. She's turned into Fatma. When she's 12 years old, she is forcibly converted. Then she is married to a Muslim, Aslıhan Yavuz. Her story is in our book, The Lost Girls of Dersim. This was the first step towards the monk's family. When we reached the monk's family, we found out that this was a family of 30 or 40. No, we assumed, that this was a family of 30 or 40. The elderly here are Garabet, Agop, Mar, Toros. The father of Toros, we couldn't learn his name because they made it Ali. Mar is the monk of that area. 9 children are saved, 3 adults are saved, all the others are killed. One of the 3 adults saved is Tirso. She is the wife of Mar. She's saved with 3 children. They are all sent on exile to Konya. The first thing done to them is changing their names. Nishan is around 12, Atkar is 9, 10, Murat is 7 or 8. Nishan becomes Alishan, Atkar, Abdullah, Murat remains Murat. Tirso is made, given another name, and they are won over to the pure Turkish culture. Then these are converted, and the 3 children are forcibly circumcised, and they live as if they were Muslims. But from the second generation, there are very interesting narratives here. My father and my grandmother used to go to the mosque forcibly, and they remained with the Alevized, and after having prayed in the mosque, they used to pray at home. And my father said, of course, God knows what is in my heart. We know, the God knows where the prayer will go. So keep your hearts relieved. They did not use the cross, but they did the following. They put the cross at the end of the beads that they had, series of beads that had this is beads with a cross. So the people who saw this thought this was a Muslim kind of tradition. Of these 3 children, one has gotten married and settled in Bolu. He is a Sunni Turkish Muslim. He did accept seeing us, but refused to talk about his life. How can I live in Bolu if all this is known? Alishan remained among the Alevized. He lives like an Alevi. He is a bit in better situation, but he has, because although he has traces of bayonet traces on his body, he refused to talk to us. The son lives in France, Apkar, Kazım. I want to speak so much, but I cannot. And he did not. So he feels very great pain. Murat lives in Paris. Because he went back, he readopted Christianity. He wanted to speak, but the children said, you should not speak, Dad, because we cannot go back to Turkey. We have our property there. We cannot protect them. So it's the children that stopped him from talking. One of the most important cases here is Toros. Toros is a young man at that time of 17 or 18 years old. He is one of the living adults. He was taken in Elazığ and then taken back and then tortured. And in the monastery, in the church, they ask him where the gold is. He knows some of it, and so he says where it is. But having admitted where the gold is, he feels very bad for years. That's why he accuses, a part of the family accuses him. Then he changes his name, which is Mehmet Balcı, to Toros. He comes to Istanbul, becomes a Christian, makes the children Christian, etc. Then he places the monk's family. If they keep together nowadays, it's thanks to Toros. Toros is no longer alive. His life story was told to us by Marian. Marian married an Armenian person, but she says she is pulled in the directions of different cultures. We did not know who Toros was. My father was a Muslim. My grandmother used to have beads with a cross. But when we came to Istanbul, they felt much more relieved. But we don't. When I went to the church, I did not know any prayers, so I used to say the Sübhaneke, the Muslim prayer in church. So I am really pulled between different cultures. This is the second generation of the family's monk's family. One other character here is Sultan. Sultan was exiled to Bolu together with her sister Küvet. Their uncle is also saved. They're sent to Bolu all together. They settle in Bolu Mengen until 1947. Then when there's an amnesty in 1947, they go back to Dersim, but not on their own will. They become young women in Bolu, and they come of age, and so are ready for marriage. The Armenian Agop and his family, although in order to protect themselves they say they are Muslims, when it's a matter of marrying their children, they don't want them to get married to Turks. In Dersim as well, although the Armenians and the Kızılbaş live together, they never intermarry. This is the kind of approach they have. But there, in Bolu, they marry their daughters to Alevis living in Bolu, and they go back to Dersim. Sultan lives in Elazığ at the moment. She's 90. The interview that we made with her was very comprehensive concerning the monk's family and that area, etc. Although she lived as an Alevi, it was very saddening to hear the following. She said, "We lost everything. Alevis, although they were attacked, they still have their faith living on." She told us about the monastery, how illuminated it was and everything. The way she talked about it led to a situation where we were really fully informed about this monk's family. We have recorded the life stories of these 9 people. of course, we have to do, still have to do a lot of work. In this process, Chrest, although she's an Armenian, got married to an Alevi, and they are very nearby. They both are in the same city, but they cannot meet there. And years after they died, their grandchildren are very sorry that they were not able to bring them together. My mother used to live like an Armenian, but she prayed to the Hızır, Muzur Baba, etc. She had nothing left of her Armenian identity. Let me complete with one thing. The monk's family is still known and talked about among the Alevis in Dersim. Despite all these attack, all the destruction of their centers of faith and learning, the grandchildren say we are from the progeny of the monk. Well, that's the only thing that binds them. Otherwise, some are atheists, some are Alevis, some are Christians, some are Kızılbaş. This is what they have in mind. Thank you for listening to us.
Çok teşekkür ediyoruz.
Thank you very much. Our second speaker is Hranush Kharatyan. He is a researcher in the Armenian Institute of Research and has a degree. He is working on Caucasia and the transition period in Armenia, the national Armenian culture, ethnic and religious minorities, adaptation problems, migration, and memory work. So Kharatyan has more than 80 articles and is also on the editorial board of many scientific and academic periodicals. So today she will be speaking to us on the subject, I am from Dersim, Avoiding Identity Among Dersim Population and Alevized Armenians of Dersim. You have the floor. I will be speaking in Armenian. I'm sorry for that, but I express myself more freely in this language. Thank you. So before coming to Dersim, I'd like to remind you that before this meeting began yesterday, Zeynep Türk Yılmaz, who joined us on Skype, was talking of these issues, and I think we need to debate more on these issues. And there is a link between what she said and what I'll say. She stressed the fact that conversion was a phenomenon, but that we needed to dwell more on the results as well as the reasons which led to that conversion, especially in the case of Turkey. There were mass conversions to Islam, but also individual conversions, and so we needed to take them up separately, Zeynep said. And meanwhile, she said that changing one's religion does not necessarily mean changing one's nationality or citizenship, and she spoke of the hemşinli. I think this is very important. It's not my subject today, but In any case, I'd like to say that we need to speak of something. The mass conversions were under pressure. And even when a decision was taken to convert in mass, this should also be accepted as a forcible mass conversion. And in the decisions taken in this respect, we see that there are very different social reactions. So when I look at the Armenian sources, for example, Dersim shows that there are absolute differences on this issue. And a very original picture appears because there is a continuity of almost 2,000 years of religious opposition. All of those who convert encounter very different problems, both on the part of those they have abandoned and on the part of those they have joined up with. And you need to have many generations go by before these trauma can be overcome. And we see that not only in their personal lives does this have an effect, but also socially and in their political or professional careers. This has important disruptions in their lives. And we see here that there is a resilience and alienation, exclusion. So we have so many new terms now. And from the Middle Ages on, those who converted were always looked down upon. There was, during the Byzantine Empire, those from Chalcedon and those outside of Chalcedon. And many Armenians were Chalcedonites or non-Chalcedonites. And that continued even after the Byzantine period. This was not only a denominational distinction, but people had been changing their religions for centuries and were always excluded by the group they left, and they were named in many different ways. Hayhoron, half Armenians, Keskes, etc. And it was very difficult for them to be accepted in one group or the other. Most of the time they spoke Armenian and they wanted to go on being Armenian, but the apostolics who spoke Armenian did not accept their religious identity and opposed their speaking Armenian. And we see this in the Alevization process in Dersim as well. And each time this led to traumas and to dramatic human relations. I'd like to touch upon another point. This was mostly an introduction. Even in Turkey, even in the 19th century, the conversion of Armenians, even if this was not under pressure and was willful, this was a pre-programmed thing where they wanted to have better social conditions. And in Turkish community, this was also perceived as such. The term Bahlavapar was used for the Kurdish circles, and they were seen as the lower layers of society. So changing one's religion, converting, was looked down upon. I believe that it will be very important to study this issue during this conference. The second issue about Dersim is that when you do general research, Unfortunately, you have very few Armenian sources and very little is said about them. In the 19th century, especially as regards the Alevization of Armenians from the 17th century on, this is the period of the Celali revolts. And from the 17th century on, the Armenians in the Dersim plateau, as well as the Suryanis, they all have their own villages. Most of them have become Alevis, and this was a willful transformation. But after this, 300 years passed by, and at the end of the 19th century, you still see that there are Alevized Armenian tribes, Ashiret, and we don't know what happened to them really. And later all was kept in silence. And nobody can say later on that the Alevized Armenians occupied such and such a territory, but there is something that is felt very deeply, because in the lifestyle of the Alevized Armenians in Dersim, there are so many clues as to their identity. And the Turkish government who tries to decide how they're going to treat the Alevized Armenians, and they try to understand what the cultural distance between them and the Armenians are. And there's something very important here which is attributed to the Alevi peers, the Dede, Alevi Dede. And it is said the distance is that of the skin of an onion. Just as the Armenians considered certain places sacred, so did the Alevized Armenians. Those were all the same. They were places of pilgrimage for the Alevized Armenians as well. In any case, what I want to learn is the process of the Armenians becoming Alevis. How did this have an impact on the Dersim people themselves? Because at the beginning of the 20th century, Rıza Nur, who was one of the young Turks, published a piece where he spoke of the Alevis of Dersim, and he said they do not have their proper identity. They have a Kurdish identity, and he said that during the 19th century Hamidiye massacres, they had reverted from their Armenian identity. Now, the impact of the Armenians in Dersim should be looked at more closely. When Kurds were bereaved of their rights, they wanted to sympathize and cooperate with the Kurds, and the Hamidiye regiments were set up. But before that, there were tribal schools, and in that process of tribal schools, you see that the children of the Kurdish tribal leaders were to learn military strategies, and when Alevis wanted to go to such schools, they were refused, and it was said that this school was open only to Sunni Kurds. This was a great opportunity, and this was a great occasion for them to feel different from the Sunni Kurds, because this was a denominational differentiation, and they felt alienated. So the Kızılbaş, as they were called, the redheads, were discriminated in that sense. In any case, after the 19th century, the Kızılbaş were no longer a threat for the Turks. It was an alternative during the Selim era, but that was no longer the case. But even now, today, in propaganda, there is degrading discourse which is held for them. It is clear that the Armenian factor also played a role here. The assimilation of Armenians within the Alevis has played a role in this. And I believe that when you look at European literature, you can see that the Dersim Alevis had a political structure which was based on the principles of the CUP, which were taken over from the French Revolution of fraternity, equality, and liberty. But in 1914, when the Armenian genocide was being prepared, there were great problems. Because there was the worry that the Dersim Armenians would also be subject to genocide, and similar things had been experienced. And this was such a great fear that at that period the Armenian Alevis was no longer used as an appellation, because they were going to forget about that. This issue came up again only after 1938. As everyone knows, until 1938, in Dersim, many Armenians were saved, and in the mountainous regions, which were hard to reach, they were able to defend themselves. But I don't know if you know that in those mountainous regions there were Armenian villages already, and their families remember also very little about the 1915 genocide. They were not so aware of what happened to Armenians in the Dersim. They lived as Christians and spoke Armenian. And there are so many other Armenian sources which show that the 1938 massacres began with the Armenians. The bombing of Surp Karabet is one of the signs of this. At least we can say that the Armenians who were able to survive after 1938 all became Alevis, and this was not a problem. They didn't have to go through a certain process. They just stopped speaking Armenian. They were presenting themselves as Alevis, and they weren't even forced to have circumcision. So that was an easy process. It was banned to speak Armenian. I speak to people who were Armenian and became Alevis after 1938, and they say we don't know if they spoke Armenian before. They say they did, but we don't know Armenian. Of course, this is a result of fear. So speaking Armenian would be negating their assumed identity. I'd also like to say that a few things about the opposition role that Dersim played as regards identity. When you look at identity studies carried out today, there are a lot of terminological differences. Zaza, Kurd, Kızılbaş, Alevi, all these terms are used. And the most interesting one is that until the year 1938, Armenians were always there. And they also called themselves Kızılbaş. But after 1938, amongst the Alevized Armenians, they just called themselves Armenian Alevis. So they joined this process as individuals. And they still have a very strong Armenian consciousness. But we see that be they Armenian or Alevi, they were not very well accepted socially. So outside of Dersim, people generally did not want to use either the word Armenian or Alevi, and they even avoided saying they were from Dersim. They said they were from Tunceli. This is an unfinished assimilation process. And those who used those terms felt the need to have new terminology. I hope I've used my time correctly. I still have 2 minutes, apparently. Now, in my last 2 minutes, let me say I am very surprised when I look at this issue of Dersim, because it is a border of the Armenian geography. And according to written sources, 2,000 years ago, there were Assyrians, Greeks, Armenians, and many other ethnic groups there. The Greek Hellenics, and it was a center of belief for Armenians. And this is why in the early Christian era, the Tim region near Erzincan is accepted as the beginning of where Christianity spread. Throughout the 4th century, Christianity was received with much resilience amongst Armenians, but the Padishah was killed in Dersim, and his son Aristakes was killed in Dersim. And against Bertanes there was a struggle, and Torhursik was killed in Dersim. So this is a very rich religious history and a very dramatic one, because the pagans opposed the Christians. And as I said before, in the 5th century, there was the Chalcedon movement. In the Dersim geography, after Armenia was dismantled, you had 2 different discourses to which Armenians were opposed. So the Armenian anti-Chalcedon and the Byzantine anti-Chalcedon discourses were opposed. And this was a place which was a source for all religious beliefs, and a place where Armenian denominations issued and grew. And after all these massacres, all those who were able to escape those massacres, people came and settled down in Dersim. So the moral culture of Dersim is an oppositional culture. So after the massacres of Selim, Yavuz Sultan Selim, the Alevis were not previous Shia. this geography, which was impossible to occupy, was a place where they found a place where they could live. And I believe that this perception of the opposition is something we need to dwell upon again, and that is what we need to work on. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, the last speaker of the day. Well, you're all tired, I know, but nonetheless, there'll be a very interesting discussion after this, I think. The last speaker today is Gökçen Dinç. Gökçen graduated from Marmara University and completed her MA at Bilgi University in the Department of Ottoman History. Now she's with the Humboldt University doing her PhD. Also, she's in journalism. She's been a journalist with many different media institutions, and between 2006 and 2012, she was the editor of Yeni Aktüel, the magazine. She wrote on historiography, on Islam and feminism, Islam and women, feminist movements and minorities in Turkey, etc. After the assassination of Hrant Dink, she went to the southeast for Muslim Armenians, and she visited Tunceli many times after the discussion on the Dersim massacre started. She has a series of articles on Muslim and Dersim Armenians, and the title for today's presentation is Protected but Discriminated, Dersim Armenians. Hello everyone, she says, but then the mic is not on. Sorry. On the one hand, it is difficult to be the last speaker. I don't want to keep you longer and bore you, but then from a more theoretical and academic point of view, I would like to look into the discrimination regarding Muslim Armenians. I don't think you'd be that bored. The Dersim Armenians to be skipping the introduction because there have been presentations on the Dersim Armenians usually up until 1937 and 38 they survived and they assimilated within the Alevi population, and I believe this to be true. We cannot really ignore this. Some really want to hide themselves consciously. Some people refuse to talk on those days. I will be focusing on two brothers on the basis of the 1937-38 massacre and how they were discriminated against, how they coped with this, and rather than their identity, I would like to talk about their belonging, sense of belonging. Let me say a few words about something personal and emotional, which explains why I've done this work. As Murat Bey said, I worked on this for Yeni Aktüel. I worked on this in 2010. This was the time when they were forming the Dersim Families Association. It was this family is from the Merakan tribe. Bedogiller is the name of the family, as opposed to the Islamized Armenians. They never hid their identity, and they did not yield to fear, and they never used the language of victimization and constantly talked about the horrors that they lived. On the one hand, they were repressed by the state, but on the other hand, they were not accepted by the Armenian community. They were discriminated against because they were revolutionaries. They looked into the future with hope, not with a feeling of revenge. I went to Mazget's Alanyazı village. On the one hand, Sema Kaygusuz explains in her novel, she says, what does it mean to be alive, to survive? I'm after that concept. Yusuf Alacoğlu, as everyone knows, said that all Kurdish Alevis are Armenians. We have the documents, he said. So I started out by asking myself whether I could do anything as a journalist to fight against this discrimination. The most important thing to my heart, among those that Hrant Dink had said, was, it's the living that will bring us together. This was so difficult at that time. I went with photographers to the southeast. We received a lot of threats. I received phone threats on my own. It was very difficult. I am very happy that this kind of conference, this international conference, is organized. And I think it's become possible because of the space opened up by Hrant Dink, especially due to his death. And this, of course, corresponds to the humanist conscience of Hrant Dink. And so I would like to focus on belonging and conscience rather than identity. When I come to the theoretical framework, I'm going to base myself on Nura Yuval Davis's concept of belonging. I think identity policies become identitaire policies, identitist politics. I don't think there's any special word for this in English. Because people who are oppressed over time become similar to the oppressors. Richard Joseph says, I think this explains it very well, in the arena of competitive politics, identities and material interests feed upon each other. Nira Yuval Davis, Identity Politics, in her book Identity Politics of 2011, first of all, focuses on intersectionality in order to avoid this. And while analyzing discrimination and inequality, one has to remember that this is all multi-layered. This is a very important contribution from feminist theory to social science. The cultural and material categories such as class, race, gender, etc. can only explain things on the basis of an interpenetration with each other. It's a matter of how human beings establish themselves in an intersectional manner in different positions. When we come to the story of the family, I think I can show much better this kind of interpenetration. In the missed piece, Kiza explains this very well. This is where the Armenian and the Alevi questions intersect for the state. And the state, therefore, wants to establish its domination on this geography, but cannot. 20,000 people were saved over Erzincan, and 20,000 people were saved, it is said. But then there are Armenians who live in Dersim. The family that I interviewed live in the Hakis Büyükkurt village of the Nazimiye district. of Dersim. Garo ve Bedro are the names of these two brothers. They migrate to Şorda. They are from Dersim, and for long years they have lived in Nezimiye. They know as the Mirakan tribe, Ashiret, in their own region. They're very wealthy. That's why during the genocide they had to pay bribes in the form of property and money to the agas of the region, and in 1937 and 38 to state agents. Some of them go to Armenia after having left Dersim after 1937-38. I spoke to the fourth generation. There's something that they remember. Garo and Bedo are called as witnesses during the frontier conflict. The agas really do not trust them, but then there are problems in the complications in the negotiations with the state. Then they changed their family names after 1937-38. Garon's children take the name Polat and Garo Postash. Bedo has two daughters and Garo two sons. There we can get the hint about when they converted into Alevism. For instance, when Mustafa becomes an Alevi, he has two Armenian wives. They want to remain Armenian. They refuse to become Alevis, and he kicks them out. The women first go to live with their relatives in Dersim, then they flee to Armenia. So I think new research is necessary. I spoke to the fourth generation, and Mustafa Bostaş, Elif Özer and Alişan Bostaş are the other two. It is said that these Armenians are silent both during 1915 and 1937-38, but the fathers of Zeki Bey said that they explained this all the time at that time. In the 1980s, in the 1990s, they did not live in this region. Zeki Bey went to Germany in 1989. He came back in 2009 for the first time. Ismail Bey goes to Germany in 1974. Then he comes to Istanbul 1 year later, and then studies in Istanbul, and then goes to Germany. So they still live there. So that's why they can speak. The father of Elif and Alişan, the Mehmet Ali Bostaş, who's 90, I went and spoke to him for Aktuel. He said that those years had not left many traces in his mind, but he wants to speak about discrimination when he finds a journalist. Even if you are Hızır, they call you Armenians. And on the other hand, they are from the Hrant tribe, but I would not refuse my Armenian vein. Hıdır Bostaş, his brother, we are from the Mirakan tribe. We suffered a lot. I don't know what happened to us. There was always discrimination. We always intermarried. My wife is from the Hrant tribe. They say we are Armenians. They say we are of bad lineage. In her book, Remembering Dersim 38, it is what is drawn attention is the discrimination, and there was this is the perception of the state with respect to Armenians. For instance, there is a myth. Mustafa, an Armenian blacksmith, is a certain person is supposed to start the Dersim rebellion, and it says they were gavur, like Armenians, infidels, that is to say, for all Dersim people. Of course, the discrimination of the people is filled with violence, but sometimes the discrimination within the ranks of the people leads to the violence of the state. Sometimes the frontiers are blurred. In the late 1980s and 1990s, this family is really under pressure. And this discrimination that they suffer, and Armenians at large, in order to understand this, we should not forget intersectionality and should bring back different categories and how these categories interpenetrate. Now, I made the following kind of schema on the basis of the narratives, because I cannot go into all the narratives. I brought out the fundamental categories. The ethnic origin is Alevi from Dersim, or Kurdish from Dersim, or Armenian. Well, revolutionism, this is political orientation. Mixed marriages, this is very difficult to take up, but it says something on gender, and the belonging of the children. Social class, it gives us hints about social class. What's in common is the home, and the hometown is Dersim. Home is seen to be Dersim. That is a very much shared point. With respect to discrimination on ethnic roots, a friend's daughter asked asked her father, "Are we Armenian, Alevi, or Kurdish?" Well, they're all very bad. Why do we hide it then? What are we? Alevi or not? My mother is Alevi. If you tell everyone who you are, if they react to this, then cut your relations with them. Alevi, Kurdish, Armenian. The child asks these questions. She questions her childhood, but she also wants to hide. Alishan puts conscience opposite this. Zeki Bey, I made a longer quotation because he explains very well what they went through. As Armenians, we were massacred and exiled and discriminated against. We are the only ones who suffered from the military dictatorship of the early 1980s. We were decimated. If you're Kurdish, if you're against the system, well, you're tortured and repressed. Well, this increases when you're a Kurdish Alevi. Then if you're an Armenian, then you cannot even define what was going to happen. During the investigation, they tell me you're Armenian. Are you going to establish an Armenian state? You are, tell me you are from the side of Ibrahim. But I'm an Armenian. I won't deny this. Culturally, I'll do whatever is necessary, but I need liberation, and for that, we need Marxism-Leninism. So the political orientation is revolutionism. Elif talks about Dersim. Dersim, I defend Dersim most. I pay for it most. I defend human rights. If you, why do you exclude me? You come and defend Dersim together with me, then exclude me. If something happens to the Alevi, one of us would go first. How can I say about social? Can I say some things about social class? Well, they used to call TIKO the organization of the Bedogil family. So it's both the people and the state. Is that easy? So the people
really show the family as a target to the state here. Alishan says, well, they were without fearless, they were not intimidated, they did not deny, we would have lost, we were all children, but they tortured my mother. I did not talk about all of this here, but they really went through difficult days. Well, they were decimated, devastated. Then even if Zeki Bey is a revolutionary within the organization, well, this person is a revolutionary, but when the time comes, they say he is Armenian. Is this really compatible with evolutionism? For instance, while we were being they went on minibuses to inform on us. So can I call him someone from Dersim? I will die for him. He kills me. But we do not really have grudge against this because of our worldview. Zeki Bey is an atheist. He does not define himself on the basis of a religion. But Alishan is also an atheist, but he wears a cross on around his neck. And be 25 here, and she says, I'm really surprised why the Alevi are fearful. Elif emphasizes tolerance, and then intermarriage. One of their women is married to a Kurd, but now the mother-in-law discriminates against her. You're Armenian, so you should be the servant of the house. Alishan cannot send his children to the Armenian school. They don't have the material means. Here, social class comes in, and on the one hand, you need certain material resources to become an Armenian. The same goes for learning Armenian. The aunt and and her husband of Alishan were very wealthy, but they go to France. So Ismail says they went to France because they're rich and owns up the Armenian identity much more closely. In conclusion, I should like to say the following. Yuval Davis talks about belonging and the policies regarding belonging, and this has to do with feeling at home. According to this, belonging really is expressed when it is threatened, it is underlined then and defended. These belongings refer these belongings are referred to by political orientations to certain identities. So Jews are seen always as German, for instance. This speaker has not turned in her presentation and is reading it. At times this is becoming really difficult. These are, of course, differentiated on the basis of space, time, and person. For all of them, though, Dersim is a home. They are constantly in pain because they defend Dersim but are accused by the Kurds. For one, it is being revolutionary, that is the meaning of life. For another, it is being a human being. They don't see being Alevi as a subcategory of Islam. When they do not really define themselves as Christians, of course, that the category of religion loses its importance, so they don't want to impose any categories. I think we should open a space for humanity and conscience. One last point. One reason why I was able to talk about the Bedouins is that those who survive are the grandmothers, not the grandfathers. So the final my final word would be through a quotation of Elif, who's so courageous. We don't want just one identity. We want a world identity. This current youth will not keep silent. They are reading. They are developing themselves. We are full of hope. Had we lost our hope, we would not have been here.
Teşekkür ederiz. Şimdi
Thank you very much. Now we can go on to the Q&A session. I'll be taking the questions one by one, and please say to whom you're addressing the question. Please keep your comments very briefly and don't turn them into pirated presentations.
Pardon, ben söz vermedim size. Kendinizden verdiniz. Buyurun.
Evet, kendi kendime verdim.
Yes. My question is about 1938. Is this the continuation of 1915? Was this carried out for the Armenians who had fled there? And this was not said, but the Armenians who settled in Dersim were not very welcomed by the Kurds. And we know that there is strife amidst the tribal groups there for the Armenian properties.
Tabii kısa yorumlayacağım hocam. Güzel.
Yes, if it's a brief comment, yes. I can't resist making a comment here. Between 1915 and 1938, I believe that there should absolutely be a comparative conference because these are both genocides, but they are very different in character. Because 1938 is something like what the American Native Indians were subjected to as genocide. And in 1915, you have the modern part of society which was annihilated. So I think this would teach us a lot if we had such a conference, a comparative conference. So this is a suggestion for the following conference. I hope the organizers hear this. I'm just going to ask a question. Now let's have an answer to the question. This is also a question for Kazım Bey. I'm taking the questions one by one. Let's have the answer to the first question. This is one of the most debated questions. Why was 1938 so different, so violent, and so brutal? There are, of course, different answers to this. First, it was a Kurdish revolution, so that was why it was oppressed with such violence. So it was an Alevi Kurdish rebellion. That's why it was repressed so violently. But the Armenian accent was not put on all this, or not enough. In the research that we carried out, we saw that the Ottoman state and the Republican state, which in fact continued in the same line of thought, were in a process of becoming a nation state at that time. And there were the Kızılbaş and the Christians, and we know the relations between them. And we also know the problems they had with Christianity later on. So the CUP also had policies against the non-Muslims, and all of these were intertwined in Dersim. And from 1905 on, this was a very planified massacre. So although this was basically a Kızılbaş issue, the state was also worried about a certain Christian existence there, presence. Of course, Dersim is not a homogeneous structure. There are contradictions and conflicts between tribal groups, those who joined the Hamidiye regiments, those who were against it. And when you look at all this, you see that an important part of Dersim was close to Armenians, the Turks, and had friendly relations in not wanting to turn them over to the official forces. But the conflict within themselves for economic or social superiority was something else. You see that there are tribal differences between Kızılbaş tribes, just as the Armenians had also conflicts between their own tribes. You can give a few examples of their not being treated very well, but we couldn't generalize. There are bad examples, but there are good examples too, and this can be said for the whole of society. But before 1930, there was the Kocan revolt. Of course, it's not a revolt, but it is the annihilation of a tribe. The Kocan tribe, who was siding with the Armenians, asked them to be turned over, but they did not. And in fact, the church, the monastery, refused to do so. And we know this from what the people tell us. Of course, there might be other claims. This is a newly researched field, and historically, as well as for the 37-38 process, we haven't been able to detail this process at large. Cengiz Çandar has seized the micro, so I think he'll be talking. I'd just like to say something very brief on what Taner Akçam said and from what Kazım Bey said. In our generation, the Kurdish revolutions were first and foremost thought of with the Dersim revolt, and we see that in fact this was not really a revolt, and as Raphael Lemkin described genocide in 1948, it is genocide itself if we're going to talk about Dersim. And here I have a question, and a very brief one for Kazım. If I didn't understand you, if I understood you well, I hadn't asked the question yet. It's all right. If I didn't understand you wrongly, you said that the 1937-38 massacre was a continuation of 1915 genocide, and that most of the Dersim population were Armenians. There are other theses about the composition of Dersim. And it is said that an important part of the population are Zaza, and they're also called Demuli. And the Demuli would have migrated from the southern coast of the Caspian Sea. And they are also attributed to a group which lives in Iran, which speak the language of Goran. Now, where do Armenians end and where do Zazas begin in Dersim? Or is the Zaza attribute something which was added on to the Armenian identity? If they were not Zaza, then who were they? And how much of Dersim was Armenian and how many were Zaza? So would you please ask this question in a translatable manner, says the chairperson. So when you speak of the Surp Garabet monastery, you said that Sayyid Riza was also accused. What was he accused with and by whom? Would you please clarify that as well? Right. The Surp Garabet monastery was bombed, and the religious objects there were confiscated. And you see in the newspapers that the chief of the bandits, Sayyid, is an impostor. He fools people with religious talk. And Sayyid Riza, even when he was ill, was rubbing his head against the cross to get better. So he was also a Christian. So, in fact, the way they treat the Dersim issue was to say that there were also Armenians there, and they were intermingled with the population there. So the Christian Armenians were a target for the state, and the Alevized Armenians were not particularly targeted. But for Christians, we know that there is a special policy. And in that sense, this is how the message was given to the whole of Turkish society at that time. And of course, the crosses and other valuable objects which were confiscated there were shown off at the police center, according to the Ulus newspaper of the time. And also in the court, they are accused in the same terms in the trial. I believe that at this stage, no one can say how many of the Zaza-speaking population were Armenians. In fact, it doesn't mean much either. I can tell you, for example, the names of certain tribes who were of Armenian origin, or a lot of Armenians who lived amongst them. And now I'm preparing a new publication where I state that the traditional Alevi discourses amongst the people are saying different things, and here you don't have the impact of written sources. In these traditional oral discourses, which are very interesting, we see traces of clues of ethnic belonging. For example, the Saint Hussein is supposed to have been related to the Armenians, which in fact he's an Alevi Dede. And Sykes-Picot prepared the first written documents on this. And when you look at that, you see that the origin of the Dersim Alevis also has to do with the beheaded Saint Hussein, who had saved, it was an Armenian monk who was supposed to have saved his chopped off head. I don't think we should go into that kind of question. Who were these Zaza-speaking Armenians? How many were they, etc. For example, I met people who were of Armenian origin and who spoke Zaza. But those spoke more difficultly of their Armenian identity. People would would try to say that they were not Armenians in Kurmanji-speaking environments, whereas in the section of the population who spoke Zaza, I never encountered the word kafir or gavur, which means an infidel. So this has more to do with Kurdishness, and this relation is always present amongst the people. We're not looking at assimilation processes here. Yes, you can look at them according to certain principles. For example, which saint had which impact on which tribe, etc. And there are also a lot of Armenian sources for this. But when you look at these sources, they're interesting, but they stem from oral tradition and cannot be accepted as absolute information. We also have written sources. I also believe that in the scope of this conference, we need to look at the religious identity. And from the 15th century already, let's use the word Kurd or Kurdish, we can say that Kurds and Armenians were absolutely in the same religious rituals, and they visited the same religious sacred places. Kutsal Varabet. And of course, these are fantastic claims. How is it that an Alevi Zaza has the memory of the religious relics which were protected from the Saint Hussein's assassination? But we know that John the Baptist is also famed for this, and relics are attributed to him in many places around this region. Can you hear me? It's not a question for Hranush, but a short comment. She said that the school did not accept Alevis in Dersim. There was this man called Hasan Hayri. He was a colonel and was killed after the Sheikh Said revolt, and he's from the Karaban tribe, a very well-known family. So he is also a graduate of this school, and there are a few other people like him, and they were also elected as deputies to the Ottoman Assembly, Parliament. The second issue In its old name, it was called Nefsi Dersim. Most of the Armenians who took refuge there were not turned in a region which was in the lower parts of Dersim. They were turned over, but those who sought refuge with the tribes were not turned over to the authorities, and one of them was Seyit Riza's tribe, and you can find this in the Ottoman archives. It should be 1336 as the old date of the Hejira, and Cemal Pasha is addressed the question of, are there Armenians which have not been turned over yet, and he says that there are in the region of Dersim. A third issue, the Kurdish Alevis in the Dersim region. As you know, Yavuz Selim, after he added this part of Anatolia to the Ottomans, he had Kurdish nomadic tribes settled there, and some of them became Alevis. Let me give you an example. The Shakak or Shawak tribe was involved in animal husbandry, and most of their villages are Alevis. Some of them are Shafi. I just wanted to contribute that bit of information. Thank you.
Rather than an answer, I think the following is important. In the fact that the Dersim Kızılbaş and the Dersim Armenians have faiths which are interpenetrating, it's not it should be taken up not from the point of view of who had an impact on whom. Because the Dersim society was very inward turned, the different subgroups carried on their faiths in parallel. And when you look at the newspapers at the time of the 1937-38 massacre, in the news reports that appear with regard to Dersim Kızılbaş, rather than the humiliation is directed rather than Alevism in general to Dersim Alevi's faith, and they really underline the aspects that come from paganism, such as worshipping the sun, etc., etc. So the Dersim Kızılbaş have original but shared traits with Armenians. Perhaps in that sense, it's not a matter of where does Zaza start or where does the Armenianness starts, etc. Or perhaps this would also clarify the Alevi transformation into Alevism of the Armenians. Yes, there is that aspect, but I don't think these should be overlooked. I think we've gone way beyond our time, and we thank you all.